In October of 2021, I traveled to Namibia to run the 7-day, 250-kilometer Namib Desert Race, which is part of the Racing the Planet 4 Desert Series. And I brought a camera, in fact, several cameras with me. The result was a 9-part series documenting my adventure before, during, and after the race, for a total of more than 2.5 hours of final content published on YouTube. In fact, that series may have been what originally brought you to my channel. Well, it's been a couple of months since the series finale, and from the start of the series, I began getting questions about how I produced it. So I thought I would finally answer some of those questions with an in-depth look at my entire production workflow. Everything from how I planned my filming in advance of leaving for Namibia, to the gear that I used throughout the 3 weeks that I was there, as well as my post-production workflow. I've also got some thoughts around what I'll be doing differently when I join Racing the Planet again here in the country of Georgia in June. Longtime channel subscribers have no doubt noticed that I've been increasingly making my films about more than just the race itself, incorporating as much about the local culture and history as possible. This is actually something I started really doing with my film last summer about my race in Quebec, the Quebec Mega Trail 100-miler, where Audrey is from and where my family originally lived as well after moving to Canada. I hope that it makes my films feel as much like travel documentaries as race films. There's typically a reason that I'm attracted to visiting and racing in the places that I choose to go to in the first place, aside from just the race, and so I try to incorporate those aspects into my storytelling. Now, this does mean doing quite a bit of research in advance so that I can plan out some of the key scenes that I want to film, and to make sure that I have enough background research prepared before I arrive. In the case of Namibia, I started with a travel guide where I was able to get a lot of the information that I needed. And in fact, I pretty much always start by reading a travel guide when I'm planning a trip abroad. I also watched some documentaries on YouTube to get some ideas for locations that I might want to visit and how I might want to film some of them. The roads here in Namibia are actually quite good, and renting your own vehicle really Most of the on-screen dialogue that you heard me say in the video was scripted well in advance of filming. Although some of it I was writing kind of as I went, especially as my plans evolved. But I definitely had all of my key talking points scripted before I rolled camera. And this even includes some of the stuff that I said during the race itself. I had some of the key information loosely scripted and planned out for that as well. Usually by about the 3rd or 4th day, you start to feel stronger. But on the 2nd day, it's all about just getting out there, just getting started, and just trusting that, after 10 or 15 minutes, you'll start to feel good again. I knew in advance that I'd be doing an episodic series for this, although I actually wasn't totally sure yet how many episodes. But I did have a pretty good sense that I'd be doing a separate episode to document my first week in the country leading up to the race, along with a separate episode for each stage of the race. But I ended up adding a second episode which documented us arriving at camp before the race began that I hadn't originally planned for, along with a separate episode about my week of travel after the race, which originally I just anticipated kind of tacking on to the final episode about the race itself. Now, I say that I hadn't originally planned on this, but I did make these decisions while I was filming. So I knew pretty early on after arriving at camp, for example, that I'd have enough footage from the interviews that I was already capturing that day to produce that second episode in lead up to the race. The last step before I left, though, for my trip was to plan my gear, which brings us to the production phase. Everything I carried with me on the trip for filming fit into a backpack, which I use as my carry-on luggage while I'm traveling. I spent quite a bit of time building up this kit during the pandemic in anticipation of a trip just like this. I'm not going to go into too much technical detail here because I do have another video that I published last year for my channel members where I break down all of this in more detail, and I plan on doing an update to this video for 2022. But this should just give you a sense of how much gear I had to carry for this trip. Now, this gear might look like a lot, but it's actually really well optimized for this kind of travel. And a lot of this is actually pretty cheap, at least relatively speaking. I do have access to more professional gear, but sometimes the best gear isn't what you want because professional grade stuff can be heavier and more cumbersome to use in a run-and-gun scenario. So for example, I use a mirrorless camera with a smaller crop sensor instead of a full frame camera sensor. A crop sensor isn't as good in low light conditions, but this camera is just a little bit smaller and lighter, and so are the batteries, and most importantly, the lenses that go along with it. And it also would be just that much less of a hit to my wallet were it to be stolen or broken. Not to mention the fact that I was pretty sure I was going to be getting sand in all of this stuff, so I wouldn't want to take any gear with me that was too expensive anyway. I brought 2 lenses, one being a zoom lens along with a wider angle one. And again, these aren't the highest quality or sharpest lenses, but I don't think I'd want to take anything more expensive out into the desert. I use a small shotgun mic with a windsock, which is super important because it can get really windy when filming in uncontrolled conditions, and this was certainly true in Namibia. I also brought a pair of wireless mics, which I sometimes use with an external lapel mic, but they also have built-in mics with these really big windsocks that work quite well. And you might notice these clipped on somewhat crudely in most of the interviews that I shot, and they really helped with the wind, which was a constant battle for me while filming in Namibia. On a more technical note, I brought a full set of variable ND filters, which help to cut down on the amount of light coming into the camera so that I can keep the iris open to give me that shallow depth of field without having to change my shutter speed. And I used these quite a lot. I also traveled with a really small tripod. I prefer to shoot handheld typically instead of using a tripod, but occasionally I will set the camera down on a table or even on the roof of a car. And while filming the interviews at camp, I was able to balance the camera on my knee using this small tripod in order to bring the camera up closer to eye level while the person that I was interviewing and I could have a conversation. I also brought a couple of GoPros with me and a bunch of batteries, as well as the Insta360 One X2. I filmed most of the race footage on a GoPro Hero 10, but I had a Hero 9 as a backup just in case, along with a bunch of spare memory cards for the action cameras and my mirrorless camera. And lastly, I brought a drone, which I wasn't actually sure I'd get much use out of, but in the end proved to be really useful while at camp. You do need special permission to use a drone in most places in Namibia, and you're going to want to register it with the government in advance to avoid issues at the border. But fortunately, I was able to work within the blanket permission that the race organizers had received, being effectively part of their media team. Now, the drone I really only used while at camp after I was done running for the day. The rest of the drone footage that you saw was filmed by the official photographer, Tiago, and by Francois, who was their local manager of the event. And normally at these races, the organizers would have actually had their own dedicated video person on the ground filming additional footage, which I would have been able to get access to. But I was happy to have at least gotten access to this drone footage. It's safe to say that the series would not have been nearly as engaging without it. So this is probably a good time to address how I actually carried all of this gear with me throughout the week of the race. And when I first began discussing with Racing the Planet the possibility of my joining them in filming at the Namib Desert Race, the idea was always that I would be there first and foremost to race, but that I'd also be kind of acting as an embedded reporter of sorts in order to document my experience. This meant that they would help me by carrying this production bag with all of my camera gear from camp to camp each day so that I could focus on running and I'd only be required to carry my mandatory race kit, just like any other racer, along with a GoPro on a little handle and a couple of extra batteries. The GoPro definitely did add a little bit of weight, but there's obviously just no way that I could have carried all of the rest of that camera gear myself and still raced. And the film would have been nothing by comparison had I tried to only film it with just a GoPro. Now, having said that, filming while racing did add other complications for me. For one, it made the week surprisingly busy. I really didn't have much spare time between racing and then resting a little before doing more filming, all while trying to prepare for the next day and to get enough rest. In the mornings, I had to get up a little bit earlier and I was always a little bit rushed to get my gear prepped and to take care of everything else that I had to do, while also gathering footage before the race each day. Even just filming that pre-race briefing each morning was a distraction, because that was time that I could have used to do all my own final preparations and generally just try to focus on the race itself. The interviews also proved to be way more of a challenge than I had anticipated, especially when trying to work around the wind. I really only had a small window each day after the race before the wind would pick up in the afternoon. And so in the end, I had to wait until the rest day following the long stage to film the bulk of the interviews that I had planned. And even then, the wind was way too strong for most of the day, so I only had a window of about a few hours to grab these. Now, you might notice that Gabriella's interview was quite short, and that's because we actually filmed that one in a hurry the morning of the final stage. And I filmed the interview with Sam, the race director, at the finish line after finishing the race, which actually worked out pretty well in terms of the story, but that definitely was not planned. But believe it or not, there just wasn't a good time for us to connect to do that at any other time during the week. Now you'll notice a second camera angle with most of the interviews, which was filmed on a GoPro. And that was kind of a last-minute decision that I'd made, but it really helped me in post-production. So in the end, filming turned what is normally a really relaxing week for racers into a very busy and somewhat stressful week for me. But I love what I do, and it also made the week that much more fun and exciting, so I wouldn't have it any other way. When I got home, the first task at hand was to ingest, back up, and organize all of my footage. I also had to spend a fair bit of time cleaning out all of my camera gear because there was sand in everything. I debated sending some of it away to get professionally cleaned, but I think I managed to get it back to an acceptable level myself. I had a ton of footage, just hours and hours, and gigs and gigs. I organized all of my footage into folders by day, with subfolders for each of the different cameras that I used. My 360 camera footage then had to be processed and rendered as well, which took some time. And I brought all of this into my editing software and began to roughly assemble the footage from each day. I also rough cut the interviews. For Vladimir's interview, I'd had him give me his answers in both English and Portuguese. So I roughly edited his responses based on the English responses that he'd given me, and then sent these off to be transcribed and translated to English. I used the translations to then further refine the edit, and then was able to use this for the subtitles as well. I had a pretty good idea of how I was going to use some of the interviews, but mixing these into the sequences was actually one of the last things that I did. I also had a pretty good sense of how I was going to structure the scenes that I'd filmed for before and after the race. But again, here I left some of the final decisions until the end. For me, editing tends to be a process of reducing the footage and chipping away at it slowly, kind of like sculpting a statue from a big marble slab. You might have a pretty good idea of the form that you're hoping for it to take, but you have to kind of let it reveal itself over time. So I always start with what I know. And that meant editing the individual scenes into smaller stories, and editing each stage of the race into its own narrative as well. I could then start to mix and match the stages with the interviews and start to rearrange some of the scenes and chipping away further as I needed. As soon as I've got the bones in place, I like to then start diving into refining some of the individual scenes to better establish a pace and tone for the rest. Again, this is as much about discovery as intent. So pretty early on, I'll begin to also incorporate music. Now, I would have already started making playlists at this point for possible tracks on the music licensing website that I use called epidemicsound.com. I was excited to see that there was a lot of what I hoped anyway would be appropriate music, if not maybe a little stereotypical of what as a Westerner I'd imagined African music to be. But it's really more about the emotion that music conveys and how it helps to progress the story. And I did feel that the music I found really did help to convey the sense of grandeur that I'd had experienced in the landscapes in Namibia.
Together, we'd run 250 kilometers through sand dunes, canyons, and moon-like landscapes, battling heat.
The first track I knew I really needed was for the introduction. I'd always planned on doing a television-style recurring intro, and that I would use the same thing for the trailer. And this would really need to set the stage for the entire series, so I knew that I needed to get it right. So now that I had an intro, along with rough assemblies for each of the episodes, I started to work on the fine cuts, which included scripting the voiceovers. I think I worked through the first 3 or 4 episodes before I started to feel pretty confident that I could then commit to a publication schedule. So it was now time to begin coordinating with the organizers at Racing the Planet so that they could help me to promote it to their audience as well. This would have been late November, early December, which left me with 4 to 5 weeks before I would begin publishing. So I now had a deadline. As I began to finalize each episode, there are a number of steps that I would take. The first is to record the final voiceovers, which I do in my walk-in closet. I've actually got a separate video that I recorded for channel members a while back that explains how I do this in more detail. I then do a sound mix where I adjust the levels between the wild sound recorded in camera along with the music and voiceover. I do a lot of what's referred to as audio ducking to bring the music down whenever there's dialogue or voiceover, and this is something that I do manually. I also add in some sound effects for things like wind and water and other ambient sounds, because sometimes what you capture in camera just doesn't sound as good, especially when it comes to wind. It's always just too distorted. Then it was time to finalize the color correction. This is actually a really in-depth process for me because I film everything in a flat color profile to give me as much control as possible later on. So on the GoPro, it means filming in what they call Pro Tune, and on my mirrorless camera, I use a custom color profile, which is similar to S-Log. I use a series of nodes in DaVinci Resolve to do my grading, and fortunately I have a controller that really helps to speed up the process. Most of the graphics I then created in Adobe After Effects, and this actually took a lot of time. The maps I first generate using Google Earth Studio, and then I add the animations manually in After Effects. Even the lower thirds I had to create from scratch for each of the people that I featured in the film. Animation always takes me longer than I anticipate, and if I'm honest, it's the least enjoyable part of the production process for me. So over the Christmas holidays, I really focused on finalizing those first few episodes to make sure that I was ready to begin publishing in early January. And I had most of them at least roughly cut, but I don't think at this point I had even started the last episode because that one just wasn't coming together naturally for me, so I was kind of saving it at that point. So as I was publishing those first few episodes, I was then going on to finish the next few. And the last couple of episodes really only got done just in time for their own scheduled publication date. And it was a bit of a staged race in itself just to get the series completed in time. So there are a few things that I plan on doing a little differently this next time around. Now, first of all, the feedback from all of you seems to be that you really enjoyed the interviews with my fellow racers. So I'm going to try to incorporate more of those in this next series in Georgia. I anticipate it being easier to film the interviews there since it shouldn't be nearly as windy and I won't be dealing with all of that sand that I had in the desert in Namibia. And with those interviews, I hope to feature more of the women's field as well. As I mentioned, it was a challenge just getting the interviews that I had managed to capture in Namibia. And of course, I was at least able to film footage of the other lead male runners while I was running alongside of them. But there really wouldn't have been much of a way for me to capture any more of the women's field than what I showed. But fortunately, the organizers will have a camera person dedicated to filming on the ground in Georgia. So I anticipate being able to get some of this footage of the lead women to help tell their story as well. I would love to have Audrey join me in the future at one of these events to help with this perspective, but unfortunately it just wasn't meant to be for Georgia. I think that now I'll also have a better sense on how I plan on structuring the episodes in advance. I'll likely also make them just a little bit longer in length, although I may reduce the number of episodes so that there's only one episode before the race, and then maybe an episode for each of the 6 stages. Gear-wise, though, I don't think I'll do anything differently. For Namibia, I had wished that I'd brought a telephoto lens for filming the animals in Etosha National Park. But I hadn't actually planned on visiting Etosha since I'd already spent a week on safari while in East Africa years ago. So I planned instead on traveling south. But this is a good example of how your plans can change when you're on the ground in a country and actually get a chance to speak to people who know better. So there you go. If you have any questions though that I didn't address, then feel free to leave those in the comments below. And while I'm filming in Georgia, I will try to grab some actual behind the scenes footage of me working, particularly from the interviews, so that you can see how I staged these as well. Because doing this making of video really was an afterthought. I almost feel like I could record a director's commentary on the series though one of these days as well. So let me know if that's something that might interest you. And I just want to say thank you all again for all of the support and all of the positive feedback about the series. It does really mean a lot. And I feel like it's just the start of what's to come for this channel.